Thank you, Presiding Officer. We want to move on from the diversion of the last few months. There were sharply differing views, and the unanimous decision of the Rural Environment Committee was a vindication of the campaign by Forestry Commission staff and unions, members of the public and all those concerned about the future of our forests. So I do want to thank Rosanna Cunningham for accepting the inevitable. I do have a question to ask her in the speech this morning. Last Thursday, she said to us that she would announce the government's response to the consultation. When she was asked, she said she'd take the decision in her own time. Less than 24 hours later, she announced her decision. So when did she make her mind up? Wouldn't it have been better to come to us, to the Chamber, on Thursday? But I do want to move on. We have argued all along that the Rothschilds' proposals were ill thought out and didn't have the benefit of a business plan. And having read the options paper from the Forestry Commission, that view has been reinforced. However, I did say to colleagues today that our intention was to enable a debate to let us move on and focus on the way forward. And the first issue that must be sorted out is the SRDP. We've previously discussed here the scheme's complexity and excessive bureaucracy. And in relation to forestry, it's clear it's not working on any level. The consultation responses demand an urgent streamlining of the process. But it's also clear that the level of support is simply not sufficient to persuade landowners, foresters, investors and farmers to plant trees. The Cabinet Secretary has already set in train a review. It would be good for the Minister to confirm today that she is committed to increasing the level of financial support to boost applications as set out in the Forestry Commission's option paper. Because there are opportunities that need to be seized. The CAP Health Check recognises woodland creation as a means of helping to tackle climate change. And land deforested under the SRDP is now eligible for single farm payments, which would offer farmers the chance to remain in farming but to transfer some land into forestry. The Forestry Commission's own figures show that their intention is that 5,000 hectares are currently being planted, but that if an extra £10 million were made available, that figure would rise to 8,000 hectares. We understand the worries about loss of prime agricultural land or indeed peatland areas, but there should be enough land of a lesser quality available. The expansion needs to be managed properly, and we support the suggestion that a land use strategy be developed. Then there is the issue of CO2 absorption. The science is complex, and it's clear that forest planting can have a role to play, but only if it's done in a sustainable way. It's certainly not a get-out-of-jail-free card for the rest of us to avoid having to think about making carbon cuts in our use of energy and travel. But extra wood for sustainable buildings, for processing and for meeting the growing demand for biomass could play a part in a climate change strategy. And wood is also crucial for thousands of jobs, particularly in our fragile rural areas. And the other major contribution the Forestry Commission can make to tackling climate change is to develop renewables on its own land. This was one of Labour's key policies at the last election, and we believe it's a vital part of the solution to the funding of new planting going forward. Within 5 years, there would be £10 million a year being generated, which could fund new planting and management, a virtuous circle, creating renewable energy and funding new forests to help tackling climate change. That £10 million would grow to £30 million a year. That would pay for a lot of tree planting and management. So the challenge is how to address that crucial short term. The SRDP is clearly important in attracting new planting, and with an uplift in grant funding, more would be attracted to apply. And we have consistently argued that we need to be spending Scottish Government money with the carbon implications clearly understood. Properly managed, the benefits that would come from new tree planting would score highly not just in value for money terms, but in value for the planet. The financial gap is relatively small and short term, so the Scottish Government has choices. If ministers were to make a relatively small injection of investment to boost the value of grants, it would transform prospects. And if they're serious about tackling the 80% targets on CO2 emissions, they need to put the financial investment into carbon-saving policies over the next decade. Under Labour, we introduced the idea of repositioning, where land is sold off with the income recycled by the Forestry Commission. Confor makes a valid point that repositioning mustn't be the only source of new funding for planting. There is clearly some scope to increase the rate of this in the first few years, but it would have to be done very sensitively. There would be no point in knocking out the Rothschilds' proposal if we were to see our forests suffering death by 1,000 smaller cuts. But it is a small timescale, 5 years, not 75 years. We would want a guarantee that once the renewables funding kicked in, that the Forestry Commission would then buy new land and fund new tree planting to replace areas lost through repositioning for the public good. And in terms of the carbon contribution made by the Forestry Commission estate, there is also the RSPB's point that the Forestry Commission's peatlands should also be looked at to lock in carbon. So there are options, and it's a question of political will and support. Now that the leasing proposals are off their agenda, there is the space to look at better alternatives. It also means that there is confidence for the supply chain and continuity of supply, meaning that the processing industry can move forward with greater confidence and scope, and there is also that opportunity for building the biomass industry and strengthening those supply chains. We know the Forestry Commission only represents a third of our forests, so any strategy must include the perspective of the forestry industry so we gain maximum economic benefit from our forests. Confor makes the point that the Scottish Government's grant was nowhere near met for planting last year. And when the economy picks up, there obviously must be a role for the Scottish Government to encourage the wood building industry to make sure that our buildings are used as a much more sustainable product. But for the short term, the challenge to the Government is to sort out the SRDP, increase the payment rates and get a move on with joint renewables projects. Given the clear parliamentary support there is for this principle, Ministers should accelerate the process now, so as soon as there is a legislative framework, these schemes can be given a green light. I welcome all the amendments that have been laid this morning, and I move the motion in my name.